Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening to learn about Juneteenth. I have some exciting news. I don't know if you guys saw, but today the U.S. Senate voted unanimously to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. We didn't plan this. We didn't call them and ask them to schedule it for tonight, but that's very exciting. It's also expected to pass the House. So tonight we're going to learn why this is so important, why this holiday is so important. And we are joined by Dr. Walton Brown-Foster of Central Connecticut State University, where she is a professor of political science. And I will now turn it over to her. You're still muted. There we go.
Hi, I'd also like to add that I am in the African American Studies program as a professor and the editor of our online journal, 1619, a journal of African American studies, not associated with the controversy. But in any case, thank you so much, Leah, for inviting me to be a part of your program. This is really impressive. I see that there are 2 pages of participants, and I can't see you all, but hello to everyone. I will spend a short time with making my remarks, and then hopefully we can have a very lively discussion, questions that Leah will field and ask. But if anyone really feels compelled, Leah, let them unmute and speak. So I thought I would begin with actually reading Major General Gordon Granger's statement that he issued on June 19th, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. And this was really an afterthought because, as you all know, the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln had set enslaved African Americans free, manumitted them. There are some technicalities in that language, but nonetheless, it was taken as the defining moment for the end of enslavement. And that occurred on January 1st. So there are actually 2 commemorations of the end of enslavement, legal enslavement in American history. And January 1st is called Watch Night. And it too is recognized and commemorated yearly, but largely as through a religious service. Juneteenth also began as with a religious observance, but it has become much more secularized in terms of events and celebrations and so on and so forth. On June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger issued the following order in Galveston, Texas. And I don't know if you've seen the map of Texas, but Galveston is pretty far south. And it read as follows: the people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. In other words, reading through the lines, you're free, but you still have to work. And for those, as we all know, very shortly after 1865, within a matter of a decade or so, the entire country reimposed a enslavement-like system of Jim Crow and the systematic abrogation of rights. And so we have to take that into account in terms of its long-term meaning. Juneteenth as a term is the combination of June, the month, and the 10th in the 19th. And so we get Juneteenth. And the fact that it happened in Texas is also very significant, because Texas had become the outpost of enslavement in the expanding United States. Many Southern planters fled to, as pressures amounted, even during the Civil War, they moved their enslaved persons to Texas in order to essentially make more money and expanding the cotton trade. And that occurred over a couple of decades between the time that Texas was an independent state and then eventually annexed and given official statehood in the United States in the 1840s. That latter political process in which Texas was annexed by Americans and the US federal government, Congress, sparked the beginnings of the Mexican-American War. So Texas became the last place where enslaved African Americans were told of their manumission, their freedom. But if you listened to the proclamation, the statement of General Granger made, they were more or less told to stay in place, be quiet, and work. Unfortunately, that latter part, work, posed a real problem. And later, many of the former enslaved African Americans began to migrate further west to California and also to Mexico. There had been a long pipeline of enslaved African Americans also escaping to Mexico. And essentially, this is why Juneteenth has become so significant, because although the common assumption was that 1861 and the Emancipation Proclamation brought a formal executive end to enslavement, it did not. Slavery continued to thrive in those areas that weren't occupied by Union troops. And as I said, Texas became the last stronghold for those moving further west and entrenching the labor system of free labor even deeper into the American experience. And so 1865 becomes very important because the Confederacy by that time had arrived in Texas further west. So the Civil War was fought as far as Texas. And then after that, this is the origins of the Texas Rangers, Buffalo soldiers, so on and so forth in the aftermath. So Texas becomes a very interesting state case and study of enslavement and slavery, the institution of slavery in the United States. I can go further into a discussion of the history, a bit of the history of slavery in Texas, which is also quite fascinating because and Texans always, of course, consider themselves to be quite unique and different. And in this, in regards to enslavement and slavery, the institution of slavery, that to some degree is true. It's quite interesting because although 1865 was the first announcement of emancipation for those enslaved by those American migrants to what becomes Texas, and eventually the annexation of this region into a state. There had been about 40 years earlier another emancipation, and that was during the time that Mexico controlled Texas. And that emancipation by the second president of Mexico, who himself was of African descent, sparked a huge conflict between Mexicans in the region and those Texans in the region who fought to separate from Mexico. And then eventually the English-speaking American migrants to Texas. So as they migrated to Texas, they brought with them enslavement and a cotton plantation system in East Texas. So this whole question of emancipation, quite interestingly, if you take the whole history of Texas, and emancipation in the United States in general, you have the Emancipation Proclamation, you have the Mexican emancipation, then the field order, Granger's field order in 1865. So I find that to be, from the standpoint of a scholar, quite interesting in terms of patterns of legislation. And then there are a whole host of other consequences that occur. The fact that today the Senate has passed legislation, was it an act or proclamation, Leah?
It looks like it's a bill.
A bill to recognize and create a federal holiday, Juneteenth, is also a great study in American politics, because for many, many years, decades, Juneteenth tended to be celebrated mostly in Texas and then Oklahoma, and largely it was isolated in that area of the Southwest, or not all of the Southwest, but Texas, Oklahoma, so on and so forth. But slowly it became a recognized reason for celebrating within the African American community across many other states as a result of migration patterns, communication, different communities developing. And if you look at the list of and the years that individual state legislatures passed bills recognizing Juneteenth, you see a slow state process that eventually culminates in today. So this legislation or this bill is preceded by an expanded, slow expansion of recognition across many states. In Connecticut, a bill was passed in 2003 recognizing Juneteenth. And I don't have the number of states in general of the 50 states that actually passed legislation. But when you see this process, this is a great study in American politics in terms of how state behavior can ultimately result in federal legislation. So this federal recognition, and I'm sure the House will pass it, is actually the result of political action on a state-by-state basis. And this is the way many political changes do occur in the United States, and is a reflection of our federalist system. Are there any questions? I can stop there if there are areas that you'd like for me to go into more detail. I'm happy to do so. I am totally at your whims, I suppose, in terms of where we want to go with this conversation. But in and of itself, that is the proclamation, the declaration that was made by a Union general, and it happens as the Civil War winds down. Oh, and I did not mention that Texas plantation owners did know about the Emancipation Proclamation, but in a very Texas fashion, decided to ignore it and not implement it. And thus the Civil War and the outcome of the Civil War resulted in the announcement being made by the military as the Union actually arrived in Texas in full force.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There was one question so far. Were some states not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation, this gets into the whole study and discussion of the politics of the Civil War, in which the Emancipation Proclamation, when you read it, you had the emancipation of enslaved Americans in those territories, states where the Union troops occupied. So it happened, it was announced in the earlier years of the Civil War that went on. And in some areas, the word got out. In other areas, though the word got out, there was still major repression of African Americans who were enslaved. And this was generally because, of course, those entrenched Confederate regions, those areas of the country still under the grip of the Confederacy, did not recognize anything that was happening in Washington, D.C.
When you talk about the celebrating of Juneteenth, And you said, it happened pretty much just in Texas and then really just in the African American community. What did those celebrations look like? Do we know? Or like, if you
Well,
really are.
initially Juneteenth, like Watch Night, started in the churches. It was a very solemn ceremony. It was celebratory, but the church, the African American church, has always been so important to the African American community, both during slavery and after slavery. It was not celebrated until 1866, actually. And in that 1 year period between the announcement and then a year later, um, although in although the proclamation in form, symbolically, there was an emancipation. If you read between the lines of that field order or of that proclamation, what did he say? Stay in place, work, right? And so, and be quiet and work for wages. But here's the rub. There was no work, and there was little impetus or desire to pay African American workers, especially as you had not only poor whites and poor dirt farmers in Texas, but also you had very resentful former plantation owners. And so there was a great amount of repression that began to unravel and unfold. Yet, despite all of those pressures, and then eventually what would occur with the end of Reconstruction and basically the re-establishment of racial supremacy all across the country, you did have this enduring faith in the notion of being free. And so the first Juneteenth celebration was a solemn religious commemoration. People got dressed in the best that they had available and honored the day. But eventually it became less religious and more celebratory. So it varies from town to town, place to place, but generally the Juneteenth celebrations involve
Food, hopefully.
food, yes, good old Southern cooking. And the further southwest you go, barbecue, well, that's everywhere, right? Um, Soul food and parties, formal, informal, like a July 4th celebration. And also Juneteenth served as a counter to July 4th. As the great Frederick Douglass pointed out, July 4th really had very little meaning to African Americans, even though African Americans were very much so involved in the War of Independence, the first to fall, Crispus Attucks. But African Americans were systematically denied any historical memory or commemoration for their service in the Revolutionary War and all of the other wars that the United States has fought in the name of freedom. And that occurred even up through the 20th century with World War II. So it serves as a counter to this feeling and this recognition that many hold, that July 4th, yes, it is a holiday that we embrace and we recognize, but we understand that our ancestors were really not recognized and not even given the benefits of the uh, the principles and ideals that those supporting the War of Independence embraced and promised. So this is kind of a good counter balance. And it has also become a celebration that all Americans have increasingly embraced. So the Juneteenth celebrations that I've attended have been citywide, and there have been yearly celebrations here in Connecticut at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford. There have also been celebrations in some of the other surrounding cities, New Britain, so on and so forth. So, and that's here in Connecticut. Other parts of the country, it will vary. There's no required, no cookie cutter Juneteenth celebration. They evolve according to the communities in which they are planned. And so it's very open in terms of, but food, you know, celebration, what do you have celebration? What is a celebration without food? So every Juneteenth celebration, I can guarantee you, has something to do with food. That's a part of the human experience. So
I'm curious about how the celebration spread from Texas to, what states did it kind of
so
spread to, and like when did things really pick up, I guess is my question.
Well, I've noticed that it has really picked up more recently within the past few decades, maybe the past 20 years or so. I suspect it is the result of communication, relocation, people relocating. As I shared with you, Leah, I have ancestry in this region. My great-great-grandparents lived and died in Oklahoma, Texas. And so naturally, the Oklahomans and the Oklahoman African-American community had a greater connection to the events that occurred in Texas. But I asked my mother, and so it goes by different names. Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, Liberation Day. So depending upon how you refer to it, it will, there may be a different recognition of what you're talking about. I don't really have an answer to your question, but I assume that it's because of the fact that African-American history is being taught and talked about more so than ever before at many different levels, K through 12, universities. Throughout universities, you have more African-American studies programs like at Central. I just saw that Harvard, so if any of you watched any of Henry Louis Gates's programs on PBS dealing with African-American history, one of his segments, he even had a program, a series on, well, he's had several African-American history series on PBS, which were aired nationally, and he had some segments on Juneteenth, so that helped to kind of spread the word. As of yesterday, another Harvard professor, Annette Gordon-Reed, who is a Texan, uh, had an event or program on C-SPAN as well, talking about Juneteenth. I've noticed that the press has caught on to this story that's been around for how long? Since 1865. And so there have been a lot of articles in newspapers, even mainstream newspapers, the Times, I think even the Wall Street Journal had an article on Juneteenth or something associated with it as well, as I recall. I could be wrong about that, but so you see a snowball effect, and I think there are many, many factors involved. Here in Connecticut, because of the legislation, PA Public Act 1912, that requires that K through 12 schools offer a course in African American, Black history, and Puerto Rican Latino history. I think there has been increasing interest in the whole story of African American history, and therefore Juneteenth would naturally be a part of that. And just the desire to know the full story of US history that is inclusive and gives the complete story. As I said, the general view is that it was done in 1861 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, that's not all of the story, because it took another, it took another 2 years for it to get to 2.5 years, 2 years and a few months to get to Galveston, Texas. And so there's a very deep story there that we can only call out if we open all aspects of American history up for full airing, view, discussion, debate, and just learning about our full history as a people and as a nation state. So I think all of those factors combined.
That relates to our next question was, how do allies support Juneteenth without causing harm or centering themselves?
They just go to the Juneteenth celebration.
I love it, and eat food.
And eat food and party if there's a party, and enjoy yourself.
This was fascinating. Thank you so much, Walton. Does anyone else have any questions? Anybody have a burning question they want to, or anything they want to ask her? If you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you. Oh, are there any planned Juneteenth celebrations in Connecticut? Whitney, I think that's, go ahead.
I'm sorry, was that it? Was that all of the?
Yeah, so, that was a question. Are there any planned ones in Connecticut? I know there's one in Wallingford.
Oh, there is one in Wallingford?
Yeah, Whitney, you can throw that in the chat if you want.
Oh, that's great. And there, you have to look for it. Usually the Current will carry notices. As I said, any of you been to the Wads? Well, the Wadsworth.
I'm a big
has a huge Juneteenth celebration every year prior to COVID. Last year, obviously, it was canceled, but I do think that now they're having a family day part of that celebration. So it depends upon the locality and those who are involved in the organizing of the Juneteenth celebration. And I think they're openly advertised.
Mm.
in the paper. It's become more and more festival-like. It has multiple scaling, multiple levels and different scales of commemoration and celebration.
The chat is blowing up with suggestions. And David found this quote, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves in the United States. Rather, it declared free only those slaves
And
living in states not under Union control.
yeah,
William Seward, Lincoln Secretary of State, commented, we show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we can set them free. Lincoln was fully aware of the irony, but he did not want to antagonize the slave states loyal to the Union by setting their slaves free.
well, there was also another, and that's what I meant when I said that uh, it only applied to those enslaved in areas where there were Union troops. But the difference between Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation is that in the South, the 5 states of the South, from Washington, D.C. on downward, it was pretty well known amongst African Americans. And I do believe that the goal, one of the strategic rationales for Lincoln's declaration, with the support of Frederick Douglass, was that this would be one way to encourage African Americans to take up arms. It had some little mixed success. The plantation owners in Texas did know about it, but you had little communication across plantations amongst enslaved people in the same way that you did in the South. And I surmise, I'm taking an educated guess here. Anyone been to Texas? It's huge. It's huge. So the level of isolation is a lot more. I also want to note that one of the differences between what happened in Texas and what happened with the Emancipation Proclamation is that in Texas and Oklahoma, you began to see a real, in response to the continued racial subjugation and repression, even after the war and Juneteenth, Texas and Oklahoma began to see many independent African American communities. And so I know recently more information about Tulsa and Greenwood, the Greenwood district, but there were other smaller independent towns all throughout Oklahoma and Texas, and many African Americans from the 5 southern states, once becoming manumitted, if you will, you did have some movements to move out west to develop independent towns, kind of a self-segregation in face of, white terror. And this process continued for several decades after the Civil War. So you also had a great migration from the South to the West. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the Great Migration from the South to the North, but there was also one going from the South to the West. And then even before that, from Texas to Mexico. So it's quite fascinating history. And there continues to be a lot of, historians continue to debate the relevance, the potency of the Emancipation Proclamation. Frederick Douglass was a great supporter. In fact, I do believe that he was somewhat concerned that Lincoln would not go through with it, but he encouraged it, and there was that strategic, that strategy behind it, simply than, the great humanitarian gesture. So
Nancy asked,
so you can say the same thing about the Juneteenth as well, because as I said, much like, although people were given freedom, the subsequent terrorism, squashed that, and then Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. So you see the same kind of one step forward, five steps backward.
Nancy asked, I heard the Texas Rangers started in order to find escaped slaves. Is this true? And were there any other law groups that got their start this way?
I can't answer in detail, but yes, in part. So you have vigilantes. Remember, Texas is right next to Louisiana, that whole area. And Reconstruction in Louisiana that spills out west, secret vigilante, white terror organizations, as well. The Texas Rangers also, had a role in the expansion of state control over Native populations. You also had the Buffalo Soldiers, too, African-American troops that also become party to controlling Native nations as well. So this pattern and history of organized policing or vigilante groups to repress and control non-white populations. You see that pattern historically in Texas. So,
John shared an interesting fact that there was a preliminary proclamation in 1862 by President Lincoln putting the Confederacy on notice of emancipation of their enslaved people if these states and parts of the states did not return to the Union by January 1st, 1863. I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
So it was part of the strategy long term. So there is a book, well, two scholars have produced very interesting studies on Lincoln and his mind. One being one scholar who either Lincoln and Douglass, Frederick Douglass, that is David Blight at Yale. And then there is a really scathing study. It's a huge book by an African-American historian, Larone Bennett Jr., who was so highly critical of Lincoln. And he points out all of these contradictions in terms of Lincoln's behavior and questions the actual altruism and humanity that many like to think of Lincoln as well. So those type of critiques are really prevalent throughout the literature that I know of. But the caveat, remember, I am a political scientist, not a historian. And we deal with history a little bit different. That's why I have focused mostly on the political processes as opposed to the history itself. So I know my limits.
You mentioned the Blight book. What was the author of the second book?
His name is Larone Bennett Jr. He's an African-American historian. He also published one of the first comprehensive histories of African-Americans in the 60s. There have been many, but in the 60s, before the Mayflower, was quite comprehensive. And then there was, of course, the great John Hope Franklin, who publishes his history of African Americans in the 1940s. And that book is still being used to teach African American history. As it's been updated, of course, and you've got new editors, but
we have, it's not a question, but it's a statement. Walton, you are a wealth of knowledge and I'm learning so much. Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Anyone else have any questions still? Does anyone, you can unmute yourselves if you want to say thank you or.
So the African American Studies program at Central has a yearly conference. Sometimes it, well, since COVID, it of course has been virtual, and we probably will continue some virtual events, and I will make sure that Leah is on our mailing list. You can also access our website on CCSU's website. So you just go to the directory AFAM studies, and we post our events, and we try to provide a lot of interesting material. The journal that I edit also has some quite interesting articles. It's kind of eclectic. So if we would appreciate your accessing them and patronizing them as well. So we can.
And I'll send all the links out after this.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions, just praise. Praise is great. Thank you so much. This was really interesting and I learned a lot, and I think other people did too. I've seen some nodding heads and some thank yous in the chat.
But I appreciate it
anytime.
I'm just an email away. I appreciate your attention and thank you very much. And if you want to reach me, I'm brownw@ccsu.edu. We can continue the conversation. I can provide you, if I don't know answers, I can point you to those who do, or places where you may be able to find them. But I'm very pleased that there is a wealth of information available online. And I know this has become a common cliche. Google it.
Or ask a librarian.
Or ask the reference librarian. Thank you very much. Let her Google it.
Figured us out. All right, well, thank you everyone. Like I said, I will send out an email in just a few minutes with all the stuff we talked about, the links, and it's supposed to be nice weather this weekend. It's a perfect year to celebrate. We can all be together again. It's on a Saturday. Juneteenth is on a Saturday, and the Senate just voted to make it a federal holiday. So there's lots to celebrate. And
I make a yard sign. Make a yard sign and have your own celebration.
I love it. Well,
if you want me to stay around and in case there are other questions, yeah. I'll do that.
Not a problem. Anybody who wants to stay and talk to Dr. Brown-Foster is welcome. I'll be here and I'll just write an email.